gay marriage and bank fraud. Now, you would assume that these two things are highly unrelated, but the legalisation of same-sex marriage led to a massive investigation into financial crimes in Australia. But please, just give me a moment to explain. So first up, let's go back to the early 2010s, and the Australian banking industry is running wild, and specifically, the financial advice sector of the banking industry. And this is mostly allowed to happen because the financial regulator, ASIC, or the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, were pretty much asleep at the wheel. Now since 2009, they had numerous whistleblowers and also victims of the financial advising departments of the big banks come forward to them with complaints. But unfortunately, there was pretty much hardly ever any justice, and ASIC sort of more encouraged these bigger banks just to quietly settle out of court rather than publicly dragging them through the courts. And specifically, these whistleblowers and these victims were reporting that the banks were selling dodgy junk financial products for massive commissions. And this also caused many of the victims to basically lose their entire life savings, so it's highly consequential. But there are also many other smaller issues, but still pretty serious, like one being, for example, that clients have been constantly charged for fees that they did not ask for, nor did they use. And a very common example of this was financial advice being given to people who were dead. So, unless the financial advisor working for the bank actually rocked up to people's tombstones at a graveyard, this is clearly fraud. And I know you would assume that this is just a bit of an oversight or an automatic billing thing, but this wasn't just a case here or a case there. It was widespread. In fact, it was extremely common. And eventually some of these whistleblowers figured out that ASIC were never going to bring justice. And so they resorted to going towards Australia's media outlets instead. So now this issue is very much on the public radar, and a lot of the population wants something done about this. And so in June 2015, two major Australian political parties, being the Greens and Labor, tried to push this through Parliament. And for those of you who are not from Australia, Labor and the Greens are two left-leaning political parties. But at the time, these two parties together still held minority numbers. They only held 70 seats out of 150. And so they were 5 short of a majority. I'm sorry to get into explaining boring politics, but this will be necessary for explaining how gay marriage and banking fraud are connected. So anyway, the Greens and Labor couldn't really get anything through. And this is because there was another couple of political parties, being the Liberals and the Nationals, and together they held a political majority. And so just for simplicity, we'll call them the LNP. And the LNP together held 76 seats, so those two parties alone could get anything passed through Parliament. And for those of you who are doing the maths in your head and you're wondering about the last 4 remaining seats, they're all held by independents. And just to give a very oversimplified version of how the LNP political alliance works, the Liberals are very passionate about their economic policies, whereas the Nationals are relatively indifferent to economic policies but very passionate about their social policies. And so that's why these two parties are so keen to work with one another, because they sort of usually don't really get in the way of each other's policies, and they can both get what they want by working together. And at this time as well, I should point out that the Prime Minister was a man by the name of Malcolm Turnbull, and he belonged to the Liberal Party. And so now, just to summarise this whole picture again, just to explain everything that just went on there in more simple words, the Greens and Labor wanted a Banking Royal Commission. However, the Liberals did not want a Banking Royal Commission, and the Nationals vote with the Liberals. Therefore, the Banking Royal Commission was never going to happen. And meanwhile, on a totally different part of the political spectrum, gay people want the right to get married. And this put the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, in a very awkward position. And the reason that this was such an awkward position for him is that pretty much everyone was in favour of allowing for legalising same-sex marriage. But unfortunately, the Nationals were very much not in favour of this, and he needed the Nationals in order to continue holding power over the Australian government. So Malcolm Turnbull, along with his Liberal government, they actually did something that was pretty smart. And this smart decision was to hold a national vote for this question, where literally every person in Australia got to have their say. And the reason that this is smart is because both sides of this debate thought that the majority of the Australian population were in agreement with them. And so there was no resistance from the Nationals before they actually passed this through to a national vote. And when the vote was finally said and done and everything was counted, 61.6% of us voted yes, allow them to get married, whilst 38.4% of the population voted not to allow them the right to get married. And I have to personally say, as a Queenslander, just looking at this map here as far as how people voted, I'm a little bit embarrassed. But anyway, I'm getting off the main topic at hand. Upon the results coming in, the government saw how the Australian population felt about this, and they immediately legalised same-sex marriage, now fall in line with Canada, the United States and New Zealand. But this now is where the story gets really interesting. And this is because the National Party were furious about this. So the Nationals were looking for an issue in which they could get revenge against the Liberal Party on. And the issue that the Nationals chose to get their revenge against the Liberals on happened to be the Banking Royal Commission. So, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the Greens and Labor had been pushing for an investigation into the dodgy banking behaviour, but it was continually blocked by the Liberals. And the Nationals just voted with the Liberals because that's where the party alliance lines were. But now the Nationals wanted revenge against the Liberals, so they then approached the Greens and Labor and then proposed that they pass through legislation that will allow for the big banks to be investigated. And for those of you who are not from Australia, someone from the National Party approaching a member from the Greens to work with them, that is very unique. I mean, these two parties are on the extreme opposite part of the ideology spectrums. And so the three parties together co-sponsored a private members' bill calling for a commission of inquiry into the Australian banking sector. And also I should mention as well that there are two members from the Liberal Party who actually went against their own ranks to support this as well. And so they were George Christensen and Lou O'Brien. To cut a long story short, they now had enough votes to get this banking investigation passed through Parliament. Malcolm Turnbull, along with the Liberal Party, saw that this was going to happen no matter what, and so then they decided to get on board at the last moment as well. And so with this, the Turnbull government announced a Royal Commission into the misconduct in the banking and superannuation and financial services industries. And this went from the 14th of December 2017 through to the 4th of February 2019. It was led by the Honourable Kenneth Madison Hayne, and he did 7 rounds of public hearings over 68 days. He called 130 witnesses, and there's over 10,000 public submissions. And when all was said and done, the final report had 76 recommendations on how to improve the Australian financial and banking industries. But to this day, only 27 of those 76 recommendations have actually been implemented. And as for whether there's any justice out of the financial crimes that had already been done, well, unfortunately, there was none. And it just baffles me as for how no one was basically locked up for some of the behaviours that they were doing and robbing people of their entire life savings. But one positive that did come out of this though is that many high and middle ranking bankers had to resign because of the public pressure just when their behaviours were made known to the public. And so although there was no direct justice, it did give the financial industry and its regulators the shake-up that it's so desperately needed.